Thanks, George Salloum, for joining us, telling us all about Syria. Before we move on to your early life, and this is the second time we've flirted with the viewers that we're going to.
Righto.
Very short clarification. The crew just asked, was it a good thing or a bad thing in Aleppo when the stadium was filled? So just wrap that story up for us in 60 seconds from beginning to end.
Excellent. Well, the mainstream media said that Aleppo was not liberated. It was now starting to be taken over by the Syrian government again. And so the story of the stadium was that the 25 or 30,000 people in the stadium were celebrating the liberation of Aleppo by the Syrian government, by the Syrian army coming in, removing the rebels or ISIS out of Aleppo, and now medicine and food was now starting to flow back into that city, and so they were all happy. They were thanking God, thanking the Syrian army. Thank you for liberating us from ISIS.
The stadium capacity was how much?
I think it's about 30,000.
And the people remaining in Aleppo at that point in time were?
It wouldn't have been much more than 30,000, I don't think. I think there was maybe about 50 to 70,000 from the reports that I've researched. Yeah. So it's quite a majority of the people that remained in East Aleppo, which was still under that. Hold of ISIS that was liberated. So the funny thing about Aleppo was West Aleppo was unaffected. They ran on doing their own business, just people's business, living their lives. And East Aleppo was...
Is there like a river between them, or...?
No, a few streets. It's a street.
Wow.
Yeah, that's how...
That's hard to imagine.
Very hard to imagine. Imagine part of Brisbane, like even smaller than Brisbane. Imagine Carindale, separated East Carindale and West Carindale.
Gee.
Quite amazing, yeah.
Wow. And so the story is that despite media reports that it was not a popular thing, it was obviously extremely popular.
Yes.
That control of the city had returned to Bashar al-Assad and his government and their forces.
Yes, correct.
Good to know. Okay, the long-awaited, much-promised and under-delivered story about being a Syrian in Australia.
Yes, sir.
So you had an interesting story, just let's start there, as good a place as any, about being in kindergarten in Australia, not speaking a word of English.
Yes, well, because my parents were the first generation over, they came in 1972, set up shop, and George comes along as child number one in 1974, and so the parents put me in school, as they would. But before getting to school, for the 5 or 6 years of living at home, my parents didn't speak English. And so for 5 or 6 years, the parents would speak to me in Arabic. So I can fluently speak Arabic. I can't read or write Arabic because I never got that far, didn't go to Arabic school. And so I could speak fluently. Okay. And so I get to school, kindergarten, first day. I don't really know what's happening, as most 6-year-olds don't. Yeah. And my mother drops me off and says goodbye and walks out. So I'm distraught. I don't know what's happening. My whole world has just been Arabs. And so I start crying. And I, to this day, remember saying to the teacher, who was an Australian teacher, or English-speaking teacher, that my mum is not coming back, but I'm saying it in Arabic.
Yeah.
She knows I'm distraught, but has no idea what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And because there were so many kids in the class that could speak Arabic only, the school realised, hang on a moment, we need to get a teacher aide that can speak Arabic, and they did. And so for the first little while, I can't remember how long, maybe 6 months, I don't know, we were speaking to the teacher aide who was translating for us. But obviously as kids, you pick up language a lot quicker. Yeah. And I do remember being able to speak English prior to leaving kindergarten.
So when did your parents go to the effort of learning English?
They didn't.
Do they speak English yet?
They speak English now, but it wasn't a formal education. It was out of necessity.
Yeah.
So 1970s Australia, or Sydney in particular, wasn't overly populated with multicultural people back then. There were some Italians, there were some Greeks and some Arabs, and Syria and Lebanon and whatnot. And so they would congregate together, but if you wanted to go buy something from the store, it was all owned by Australian people, or English-speaking people. So they would go there and they would have to be forced to, they would show pictures of rice bags. Rice. And so that's how they learned. And so as time went on, Dad started his own business in the building industry. And so he had to learn how to speak English in order to conduct business. So, yeah.
So what was the assimilation process like? We're really familiar with immigration now. Come to Australia and we'll put you on welfare and take care of everything for you.
Yeah.
Early 20th century, it was come to Australia, look after yourself.
Correct. Very much so.
So what was it like in the 70s? Was welfare happening then? Like,
not that my parents ever spoke of, and I don't think there was welfare. I can't speak to the Australian policy. I haven't researched that. But my parents would always intimate that when they came to the nation, they were so happy to be here that they would tough it out. So my father and mother lived with my uncle and his wife in a rented house for a little while they started their own little painting business. So they would paint homes before they went into building. My auntie was a seamstress, so she would fix people's clothes and sew dresses and whatnot, all to make money. It was all labour-intensive work that they had, and that's all they did. That's how they lived. If they didn't work, they didn't get paid.
Yep. And what kind of cultural conflicts do they reminisce or remember and share with you now? Like, was there resentment about stealing Australian jobs or any kind of...
Not that they ever spoke of. They never felt that way. I'm sure there might have been that back then, but I never had the sense... I'm
just talking about their experience.
Yeah, I never had the sense from my family that they were ever ostracised. The English-speaking, the Australians who were here before, they arrived, they were very loving, very open, very caring, but that's because I believe... parents of my parents' generation, or people of my parents' generation, came with the ideology of assimilating into the Australian culture. That they loved the freedoms, they loved everything that Australia offered, and so they wanted to be a part of that, even though they kept their own values. And so, like I've said to you before, my parents moved out here in the early 70s, and they literally brought the values of 1970 Syria into Australia and lived those values. Now, what I mean by values is they brought respect, honour, for your family members, your elders. I was very strictly taught. If your uncle walks in the room, you don't just give him a wave or ignore him. You get up, you stand over, you give him a kiss and say hello on the cheek, out of respect. Yep. If your auntie walked in the room, if your mother spoke to you, if I ever back answered my mother, which most first generation migrant children will tell you, that if I ever back answered my mother, my father was there with a backhand straight away. He knew you knew straight away that that's not how you speak to elders.
Respect your mother.
Respect your mum. Honour, respect, valuing people, understanding that people are different, and so you have to work with that. So I was brought up in that way. All of my siblings, all of my cousins that were in Australia, and all of our friends.
Now, talk to me about assimilation. So
Yes.
you've said they didn't learn English,
Yep.
and they brought their Syrian culture and values.
Correct.
What kind of things did they give up, other than the things they had no choice over? What kind of things did they choose to give up to better assimilate into Australian culture?
Yeah, good question. I would say understanding that certain things that they would do on how to raise a family couldn't be done here anymore. Like, for instance, they had to learn that their children may not marry Syrian or Arabic-speaking partners. And so even though that took a little bit of getting used to, they had to get used to that, and they did. And, so I'm married to a non-Arabic-speaking wife, so is my brother. And so, and the family loves them as if they were part of the family, and they are part of the family. And so, so that took a little bit of getting used to, but they got there. And various other little things along the way, understanding that we were going to have English-speaking friends. And so they would encourage us, even though initially it was a bit of a hang on a moment, I don't understand what this friend that you've just brought home is saying, because he's speaking to you in English and you're in year 6 now, and this friend of yours, this neighbour friend of yours is I don't really understand what he's saying, but I will welcome him in, And I remember my mother constantly feeding my Australian-speaking friends hummus and tabbouleh and garlic and kebabs, and this young boy who was used to just eating, meat and 3 veg is going home fat-bellied. That's right, and spiced up on all the garlic.
And how did they like it? I know as a kid I was so fussy, I wouldn't have given hummus a second glance.
Yes, yeah. Some friends were like, "Oh, no, thank you." But I think some would see my dad, who was an ex-army, a soldier, would see my dad, and he's quite a stout guy, a lot more relaxed now, but quite a stout guy. Okay, I'll eat the hummus. No worries, because Dad would offer it like this: "Want hummus?" Okay, I'll eat the hummus. So that was quite interesting watching that.
Yeah, that's funny. Now, something I find absolutely fascinating is, and I should know better, being a student of theology and church history, the Middle East was Christian long before it was Muslim.
Correct. Yeah.
But I just think everybody from the Middle East is Muslim.
Right.
But your family's not.
No.
So tell me how that works. In Syria, they were Orthodox.
Yes. So the family's grown up in an Orthodox lineage, and I would say that originated, or from my research, that originated because both mum and dad's family or ancestors lived in the villages of Syria, which were extremely remote hundreds of years ago. So I think when Islam came into Syria, and you have to remember, history shows that Islam came violently into those nations.
That's right.
And so as it came into those nations violently, they couldn't get to some of these remote areas, like Dad is from Zwaytini. It's a village called Zwaytini. And so very remote, had a very big monastery / castle that was its protecting sort of frontage.
Branch of Orthodoxy, is that Syrian Orthodox?
There is a Syriac Orthodox branch of that. Where it goes back to, I think it's Antiochian Orthodox as well. So there is a branch of that. And so my parents grew up in that belief system.
That's fascinating, because they were rural.
Because they were rural,
weren't reached by
correct,
Islam.
Yeah, and because Syria, Syria, even under Bashar's father Hafez, who was a bit more of a dictator, he allowed Christians to have churches and to have monasteries and left them there, and so they were able to practice their religion and worship God as they saw they needed to, without having to adhere to Islamic belief. Yeah.
And did that cause any conflict in the 70s or the 80s?
My friend, this is probably the most interesting of the facts that my parents would share with me, or that I saw growing up, was that there was a complete tolerance, if I could use that word, which is totally different in meaning now, but a very much dovetailing of people who, well, you're a Christian, you're a Muslim. Well, that's what you believe, that's what I believe, but surely we can do life together. And they did. And so growing up, because like I said before, they brought 1972 Syria to Sydney, they when Muslim believing neighbours would move into the neighbourhood from the same regions, we would go over when they were celebrating Ramadan. They would come over and congratulate us for Christmas, and that's how I was brought up. I thought that was normal, right? And that was just very much we do life together. We're not, we may believe different things, but you're a human, I'm a human. There's dignity, there's value, and that's how they lived.
That's awesome.
Yep.
And was that different when you went back to Syria in the 80s?
Well, when I went back in 1983, or when I went in 1983, that wasn't too much different. Some of the values, young people being taught how to value your elders was a little different. Yeah. But there was still a cohesion between the Muslims and the Christians, or being cultural Muslims or cultural Christians, people who are nominal, if you can use that word. Yeah. They just lived life. That was just normal. Your neighbour was Muslim, the other neighbour was Christian. That's what you did. Yeah. When
did that change?
Looking back in hindsight, I would say after September 11th, after 2001, 11th of September, there was a shift, like I think there was in the whole world. And I noticed a change with the way I was being treated, getting onto aeroplanes and whatnot, which we spoke about earlier. But I noticed also going back, I'd moved to Brisbane by that stage 2 years earlier in 99. So therefore moving back going back to Sydney to visit family every 6 to 12 months for the first few years of being here, I could see the distinct differences happening. Because I wasn't living in it, I would go back 1 year, go back the following year, notice, hang on a moment, that neighbour's now treating my family different. That Muslim neighbour's treating that family member different. The way they're conducting, the way they're approaching my father, being a woman of the Islamic faith, approaching my father was very different. No more shaking of hands. I noticed there was a distinct change in the Islamic people around us. Now, whatever that reason was, that's their prerogative. But I did notice the change. Yes. So after September 11th.
I assume you had childhood friends that you occasionally caught up with, maybe from the neighbourhood or other things. It's interesting that you noticed a marked change. What other manifestations of that did you see?
Yeah, well, I started to notice that every time I would go down, there'd be another change in a friend that I grew up with who either was a nominal Christian that became a Muslim, or Muslim friends, or kids who were my age who grew up in Muslim homes and nominal in their approach. I don't remember ever speaking about religion with these guys growing up. I left Sydney when I was 25, so I wasn't a youngster when I left Sydney to move to Brisbane, and so we never spoke about religion. And then 2, 3, 4 years after 9/11, I would see these friends grow beards, shave mustaches, become a little bit more fundamental. And so that, and also treating me a little differently, speaking to me a little standoffish, finding out being a pastor of a Christian church. So, many questioning that. Some would even ridicule that, in a joking way, but you could see there was a hint of truth in what they were trying to infer, and I would say that was coming from somewhere. I would say there was some leaders that these guys were adhering to. Some of them would openly say that to me. So and so would say what was being preached to them, and so they would say those things to me. I didn't take too much notice of it back then, but now, fast forward 10 years, 15 years,
it's formed a bigger picture.
It's formed a bigger picture. When you look back in hindsight and you think, okay, I could see what was happening now. I could put
Why do you
these
think
pieces
that's
together.
happening? Wherever it's coming from.
Well, I think what the landscape of what happened with 9/11, the popular view of the Islamic world, a terrorist attack on America. America then demonizing the Muslim world and then moving over into the Middle East, and we all know the rest is history. We all know what's happened there, and that quickly put a divide between the Islamic world, the Western world, which I don't see. I think, okay, I can understand that. I can see the ideologies are extremely different, and anyone who thinks that the Islamic ideology and the Western ideology can mix, don't really know either of the ideologies. Sure. But what got me the most was that these friends were born and bred just as I was in Australia, and so the fact that they quickly maneuvered to a place where they opposed themselves to me, as opposed to befriending even more so in such times, that was probably the most surprise.
Yeah, I think that's a profound observation that needs to be considered when we're even thinking about things like immigration priorities.
Yeah,
is if somebody is nominal now in their ideology, cultural only, and not religious or extreme, what assurances do you have that they will always be nominal or cultural only? Yep. And if it goes to its logical conclusions, does that look good and complementary to Australian culture?
Yeah.
And I think that's a fair question.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong. Please let me tell your audience that I still to this day have very close Muslim friends. Some who have become more adherents to the Muslim, faith rather than what they used to, but haven't gone any further than just to read the Quran and go to prayers and do their thing, but are still loving, caring people who I'm very close friends with to this day, and we have great debates, and I enjoy that. Yeah. But they're not the ones I was concerned about. Yeah. It was the ones who, speaking to down the street who would give me the flick. Hang on, mate, I used to play rugby with you for 8 years, growing up through school and winning premierships with you, and now all of a sudden you don't want to, because you're of one faith, I'm the other. Where is that coming from? Yeah. I've eaten at your table with your family. Yeah. You've eaten at my table with my family. And mind you, that's a very big thing for the Arab people. Having dinner with someone is a huge acceptance into the family. This is not a passing, just a little meal for energy. It's actually, you come to my table and eat, I consider you family. And so that's how it works. It's not a small thing to be invited to.
That's nice.
It's wonderful. It's very honouring.
I haven't been to your table.
Well, you're invited.
No subtlety there at all.
No subtlety at all, no.
You left Sydney when you were 25.
Correct.
A couple of years prior to September 11th?
Yes.
How cultural or fundamental were you in your Christianity at that stage?
I would say quite. Yes.
You were?
Yeah,
Okay.
very
Because
much
your
so.
family was, you said, cultural Christians.
Yes, correct.
So tell me about your journey to fundamental Christianity.
Yeah, well, it was I gave my heart to Jesus, if I could use that terminology, in 1992 at the age of 18. And that's when I started really delving into the Bible and figuring out what this God that I'd seen, statues of Jesus and Mary and Joseph that my parents would have up, not really knowing what they were. And so I delved into the Christian faith after making that decision at the age of 18. And so by the time, that was in 92, so by the time I left Sydney in 99, I was 7 years into that journey and very much enjoying it, very much a part of my local church. And then when I moved to Brisbane, I moved and become a pastor in 1999.
Okay.
And so that obviously has begun the rest of that journey.
That's important because I guess what I was thinking was it's possible that your neighbours who became more fundamental in their Muslim faith, it might have just been the passage of time and maturity, but that had happened for you prior to the separation.
Yes, very much. And even
wasn't a parallel path in different directions
at all. And even in that, now that you've mentioned that, if I think back from 92 to 99 before I left Sydney, or even to 2001, there wasn't, even though they knew I was a Christian, I was going to church, they would ask questions, but there was never this standoffish, arm's length discussion that was very evident after 2001. Yeah. Now, and let me just throw a little bit of a personal note in there. I remember getting into airplanes after 9/11 and being the way that I look, I understood people's uncomfortableness of getting in there. Some of my friends who are Arabs as well would go on a plane and they'd get upset that they were being targeted, come out of the line. But I think almost every single flight that I took for the next 5 or 6 years, I knew I was going to be pulled out of line, asked to take my belt off, my shoes off, my jacket off, swabbed and tested and at random. But I understood that. I understood this is the world now. Yes. Just work with it.
That's right.
Don't make it worse. Just be nice.
Yeah.
I understand what you're doing. And so
that's mature.
Well, thank you.
No, it's good. When we come back, we'll have a chat to George Salloum about politics and the pulpit and if they can mingle and mix.